You've probably never heard of Bill Browder, but the American businessman is doing something incredibly risky. He's going head-to-head with one of the most powerful men in the world, Vladimir Putin. Browder claims Putin has turned Russia into a criminal enterprise. And as Mandy Clark reports, he's out to prove it.
Strongman, statesman, devil-may-care sportsman, sex symbol. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been called them all. But to Bill Browder, Putin is nothing more than a common thief and hoodlum running a gangster state.
Russia is a kleptocracy, and those are just words, but what they mean in reality is that all of the money of the country is stolen.
If you steal all the money from your country, won't the people just rise up?
Well, they did in Ukraine, and that's a terrible, terrible thought for Putin because he saw what a minor kleptocrat, what can happen to him, and Putin is a major kleptocrat.
Bill Browder wasn't always one of Vladimir Putin's critics. This American businessman's views changed after coming face to face with the darker side of Russia's endemic corruption.
You could call it naive, or that I just deliberately didn't pay attention to the risks.
Browder is an investment banker who lives and works in London, England, a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist with an unexpected pedigree.
I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, he was an amazing man. He was on the cover of Time magazine, was recruited by the communists to come to Russia, returned to America in 1932, where he became the General Secretary of the American Communist Party.
Rebelling against his left-wing heritage, Browder went to business school before entering the world of high finance in London. In the 90s, he realized he could get rich in the former Soviet bloc.
Eastern Europe had just opened up, and I said, well, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe.
Browder moved to Moscow, where he set up an investment fund called Hermitage Capital and began investing in Russia's newly privatized companies. With $4 billion in assets, Hermitage became the largest private investment fund in Russia. But he soon discovered others coveted that wealth.
I realized that all of the companies that we were investing in were effectively being robbed by the oligarchs or the government officials who were the managers of those companies. It was what I call the largest orgy of stealing that's ever taken place in the history of business. And so we came up with what we called naming and shaming campaign, where we research how the companies went about doing their stealing, share it with the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times. And then once it was sort of fully circulating, the people who were doing the stealing would effectively be too embarrassed to do more stealing.
So when Vladimir Putin came to power, Browder was delighted, believing the former KGB agent was an anti-corruption crusader, willing to take on the Russian oligarchs.
And so by the year 2000, I was so sick and tired of it, and so was everybody else, that they had this new guy show up, this sort of fresh-faced, clean-cut guy named Putin, who promised to bring some order back into the country.
Putin succeeded in weeding out the worst by forcing them either to leave the country, bend to his will, or throwing them in prison, such as Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of the Yukos oil company, who maintained his innocence.
And when he arrested Khodorkovsky, I thought, great, and maybe this will create a normal society.
While Putin was breaking up the oligarchy, Browder continued his naming and shaming campaign. But the first sign Browder's trust in Putin might be misplaced happened in 2005, when Browder flew into Moscow one day.
I was detained at Sheremetyevo Airport and then deported from the country and declared a threat to national security.
You didn't see it coming?
I didn't see it coming. I thought before that point that it was maybe some type of clerical error. And when an official letter had been sent to me defining me as a threat to national security, I knew that was just the beginning of my troubles.
Banned from Russia, he moved to London, stunned at what just happened.
But then I was trying to figure out why it was that they had expelled me, because I had been making lots of noise for a long time, and I thought actually that I was doing sort of a service for Russia by exposing the corruption.
Could you believe it that you were a threat to national security?
I thought I was a threat to corrupt businessmen, but if they equate national security and the ability to do their corruption, that was a very stunning discovery.
Next, the corruption turns violent.
They tortured him. They tortured him in a number of ways.
With Vladimir Putin in power and Bill Browder banished to London, the problems of corruption in Russia only got worse, as Browder was about to find out firsthand.
No, I could have never predicted this. I have to adjust to the circumstances, and these are mine.
Browder kept a branch of his investment firm, Hermitage, open in Moscow. One day, Russian police officers stormed that office, along with the offices of Hermitage's law firm.
All of a sudden, I heard some kind of commotion in the reception area, so I went in there, and there were 20 plainclothes officers, and they said, "We've got a search warrant."
Jameson Firestone is an American lawyer who ran the Moscow-based law firm that worked for Hermitage.
They would grab documents, and they'd look at them, and they had accountants there. They go, "We got this company, this such and such name. It looks like it's paid like, at least $30 million in tax. Should we take it? Yeah, take that one, take that one." And they just did that for the whole day. These guys were only interested in companies that had paid taxes, and they wanted companies that had paid 8 figures or more in tax. There was a lawyer who said, "Your search is illegal." And they beat him up really badly, and they put him in the hospital for 3 weeks.
What did they do with your seals and all your company documents?
Well, what we learned 3 months later was that we no longer owned our companies.
Browder hired a talented Russian tax lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, to get to the bottom of why the police took the documents.
Sergei was by far the most vigilant, smartest, and most self-confident lawyer we knew. And he was a very morally strong person, and we wanted somebody like that to work with us.
What Sergei Magnitsky found was that Hermitage's papers had ended up in the hands of a sophisticated criminal network made up of crooked cops, tax officials, lawyers, and organized crime.
They'd given the documents to organized criminals who used them to arrange a $235 million fraudulent tax refund. So they basically stole all the taxes that Bill Browder and Hermitage had paid.
In total, the criminal network stole $235 million from the coffers of the Russian government.
That's an incredible tax scam.
It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, paid out in one day, no questions asked.
Browder's team discovered that Putin had replaced the old oligarchs with his own group of corrupt businessmen.
Yes, everybody's on the take, and all the way at the top, even if Putin didn't get any of this money, his buddies were on the take, and having to choose between protecting the money of the Russian people or having to protect his corrupt friends, he made the choice that he always makes.
His friends.
Absolutely. In the early 90s, you had criminal groups. You could recognize them. They had bald heads, and they wore tracksuits. Putin changed everything. His top-down vertical management, he essentially turned the entire government into one large crime apparatus. So now what happens is the very people who are supposed to be helping you are the people who are hurting you. And you sit there and you realize, my God, Every single aspect of this is completely controlled, and there's nothing I can do. And then you lose everything and you go to prison.
Sergei Magnitsky was determined to expose those criminals, even testifying against them.
Wasn't that an incredibly dangerous thing to do?
It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, but we thought that this couldn't possibly be allowed in Russia.
After the police raid, Browder closed his offices in Moscow and moved his staff to London. But Sergei Magnitsky refused to go.
We begged Sergei to take the steps to get the visa and leave the country.
Ivan Cherkasov is a Russian-born partner of Hermitage.
Sergei was a very simple fellow. He said, this is a crime and we must report it. He's sort of living in the world where he saw that the law, if you obey the law will protect you as a lawyer. And but that's where he was wrong.
In 2008, Sergei Magnitsky was arrested at his home in Moscow by the very police he'd testified against.
What happened to Sergei in prison?
They tortured him. They tortured him in a number of ways. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to sleep deprive him. They put him in a cell with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, where he nearly froze to death. And after 6 months of this, his health broke down.
Held for almost a year in terrible conditions, weak and ill. One day in 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was beaten by 8 guards with rubber truncheons until he died. The authorities later claimed he'd had a heart attack, but these post-mortem photos clearly show signs of the beating.
What was your reaction when you found out he died?
It was like a knife going right into my heart. It was the worst news I've ever had in my life. It was just a complete life-changing telephone call. After sort of recovering from the shock, I made a vow to him, his memory, his family, and to myself that I was going to make sure the people who did this face justice.
Why?
Because Sergei Magnitsky died because he worked for me. If he hadn't worked for me, he'd still be alive.
Next, Browder's crusade for revenge.
I couldn't live with myself if I didn't get justice for Sergei Magnitsky.
With Putin and his cronies in power and Bill Browder's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, dead, Browder was convinced his only option was to expose those responsible.
This was Stalinism in 2009. And because of that, we figured there had to be justice, that they just, no matter how corrupt, no matter how evil the Putin regime was, they couldn't let this go unpunished.
Using his considerable wealth, Browder began an international media campaign to raise awareness into Sergei Magnitsky's death and the questionable circumstances surrounding it.
I was once the largest foreign investor in the country. Things have gotten a lot worse. The rule of law has seriously been undermined.
You have these essentially organized criminals working out of government positions. You not only could lose your money, but you could lose your life.
Is that a country you want to invest in?
And we went to the US Congress and we said, let's ban the people and freeze their assets who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And this eventually evolved into what's called the Sergei Magnitsky Act. And those people are now, their names are alongside Al-Qaeda terrorists and drug cartel leaders as similarly sanctioned people.
Browder also worked to expose how the Russians who stole the $235 million spent this wealth, a campaign given a boost when his telephone rang one day.
One day in the summer of 2010, we got a phone call from a man named Alexander Parapolichny, who was part of the group of bad guys and had fallen out with them and wanted to share with us financial information about these people.
Parapolichny, a Russian banker who had fled to London, had documents revealing how members of the criminal network bought lavish homes, cars, and moved money into offshore bank accounts.
How important are these documents?
They were explosive. They proved the conspiracy. And they showed the names, and they showed the banks, and they showed the wire transfers.
Browder kept assuming that by publicizing this information, Putin would finally investigate the criminals.
All along the way, it surprised me that, with a major, huge international condemnation of what's happened, that Putin would side with the bad guys. He'd basically throw in his lot in with the bad guys and take a personal interest in the obstruction of justice. They not only let it go unpunished, they exonerated every single person involved. They promoted them, gave them state honors. And so effectively, Putin became the biggest oligarch in the country. And so he didn't eliminate oligarch capitalism, he just took over oligarch capitalism.
Corruption in Russia is completely institutionalized.
It's completely institutionalized, and it's a protected industry. It's a government-protected industry.
A glaring example was last winter's Sochi Olympics, where Putin's circle of cronies received most of the contracts to build the site.
They spent $50 billion in the Olympics, and probably $40 billion of that was stolen. And now the whole world got to see it. This was Putin's big showcase, and he was a showcase of corruption.
But instead of pursuing the culprits of the $235 million theft, Putin's government has gone after Browder and his allies. Last year, Russian prosecutors tried both the deceased Magnitsky and Browder in absentia for the very crime they had exposed, handing Browder a 9-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, Alexander Parapolichny, the Russian whistleblower who had given Browder critical documents about where the stolen money went, was becoming worried about his safety.
Was he worried that he was being followed?
He must have been. He had been warned that his name was on a hit list, that there was a price on his head.
Then one day in 2012, Parapolichny mysteriously dropped dead after jogging near his home on the outskirts of London.
Do you think he was murdered?
Oh, here you had a 44-year-old guy who was providing documentary evidence of Russian mafia money laundering, cooperating with a Swiss prosecutor, healthy man who just drops dead outside his house in London. The coroners can't determine any cause of death, no cause of death.
In total, at least 7 people connected to the $235 million theft have died, mostly in Russia. Browder has received a steady stream of threats.
They're very explicit. They're not beating around the bush, and they're threatening me or my colleagues.
For Browder, justice for Sergei Magnitsky will never happen unless Putin departs.
Is there any hope?
Yeah, regime change.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no... Look, Vladimir Putin looks at pictures of Gaddafi and talks about what a tragedy this is because he sees himself being dragged through the streets with a bullet through his head and people taking tours of his palace and saying, wow, look at all this money he stole.
You're going after a very powerful man, the most powerful man in Russia. Why do it?
Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. By any objective measure, they were going after me, not him. And he died, and I didn't. And it's my duty to him and his memory and to justice that we make sure that the people who did this don't get away with it.
And that is our broadcast for tonight. I'm Carolyn Jarvis. From all of us here at 16 by 9, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Heritage, Browder went to business school before entering the world of high finance in London. In the 90s, he realized he could get rich in the former Soviet bloc.
Eastern Europe had just opened up, and I said, well, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe.
Browder moved to Moscow, where he set up an investment fund called Hermitage Capital and began investing in Russia's newly privatized companies.
You've probably never heard of Bill Browder, but the American businessman is doing something incredibly risky. He's going head-to-head with one of the most powerful men in the world, Vladimir Putin. Browder claims Putin has turned Russia into a criminal enterprise. And as Mandy Clark reports, he's out to prove it.
Strong man.
People just rise up.
Well, they did in Ukraine, and that's a terrible, terrible thought for Putin because he saw what a minor kleptocrat, what can happen to him, and Putin is a major kleptocrat.
Bill Browder wasn't always one of Vladimir Putin's critics. This American businessman's views changed after coming face to face with the darker side of Russia's endemic corruption.
You could call it naive, or that I just deliberately didn't pay attention to the risks.
Statesman, devil-may-care sportsman, sex symbol. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been called them all. But to Bill Browder, Putin is nothing more than a common thief and hoodlum running a gangster state.
Russia is a kleptocracy, and those are just words, but what they mean in reality is that all of the money of the country is stolen.
If you steal all the money from your country, won't the...
Browder is an investment banker who lives and works in London, England, a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist with an unexpected pedigree.
I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, he was an amazing man. He was on the cover of Time magazine, was recruited by the communists to come to Russia, returned to America in 1932, where he became the General Secretary of the American Communist Party.
Rebelling against his left-wing